So welcome to everyone who's joined us. We've got 103 participants so far, which is absolutely fantastic. Welcome to this morning's webinar, which is all about growing food at home with the wonderful Kat Lavers, who you can see before you on your screens. I do really hope that you and your families are all keeping safe and well during this strange time that we've still kind of found ourselves in. My name's Beck Nichols and I work at the City of Stonington in the Sustainable Environment team, and I've organised to this morning's webinar. I do want to start us off by acknowledging that whilst we're spread out right across Melbourne and maybe even Victoria and likely the world, we are meeting on the lands of traditional owners in Australia. And so I do want to pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognise the cultural heritage of this land. I myself am located on the lands of the Wurundjeri people just near the Yarra River. So if you'd just like to recognise the owners of the land on which you are, and if you're not sure of who that is, I definitely recommend looking that one up when you get the chance. So we did have a total of 390 people register for this webinar, which is really, really exciting. This webinar this morning is the first of a series of 4 with Kat Lavers, and we're coming up over the next 4 Saturdays in May and June to support you guys with gardening, with growing food at home, with managing pests, having healthy soil and propagating plants as well. These workshops are also part of a wider series coming up in May and June the cities of Stonington, cities of Yarra, Port Phillip and Glenara have all joined together to deliver. And it's a series really designed to support you guys to live sustainably at home and take climate action from home. And so, yeah, really excited to have 4 workshops with Kat Lavers today, but there are over 16 webinars as part of this series on a whole wide range of topics, right from gardening at home, habitat gardening, keeping chooks, all the way through to renewable energy, draft proofing your home, also citizen science and nature play. Just going to grab a drink, excuse me. Got a bit of a croaky voice, very convenient. And yeah, so this series is really our response to the pandemic that we've found ourselves in, and it's really aiming to help you guys to learn new skills and knowledge to help you reduce your costs, reduce emissions, use resources carefully and be more sustainable at home, and really to learn these skills during this pandemic, but also they are lifelong skills that you will continue to use. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we do launch into things. Right now you have all been muted, and that's just, we'll keep a kind of muted state throughout the majority of the webinar, just to ensure we have the best audio quality for everyone and make sure we don't have any dogs barking to interrupt. But I'll talk through the process for questions in a minute. We will run for 2 hours, so taking us till about 12 p.m. today. But just in terms of questions, there are a couple ways to ask questions. So you can use the chat box, which I think is, it's going quite well so far. Lots of people telling us where they're coming from. So feel free to type your questions. And what we'll do is, we'll be working through the chat box and we'll be pulling out all the questions, and we'll be having questions. Kat will kind of go through a topic and we'll address some questions. I think there's 4 parts to this. The other way to ask questions is through the raise your hand function, which is in Zoom. Kat might actually have to explain a little bit more about where that is, because my screen's looking a bit funny and I don't want to give you the wrong instructions. But you'll be able to raise your hand, and then you can use your microphone to ask a question. And it's a really nice way to just have a bit of dialogue between us all today. Just to note that this webinar will be recorded, it's recording now. So if you do want to keep your video and your mute on for that reason, that's totally fine. But do note, if you do use your voice and your video that will appear in our recording. This recording will be emailed out to everyone following this webinar. And a little note to say that Kat has also compiled some wonderful notes for you all that we will also share after the webinar. So no need to take furious notes. Yeah, you'll get some really good notes from Kat. We will be pausing for a little mini break, half time, just in case you wanted to grab a drink or stretch your legs, do a little star jump and get the blood running. And I also want to introduce Andriana from Glen Ira Council, who's joining us today, and she's helping us with moderating some questions. So yeah, you'll see her as a co-host, she may answer your questions at some stage. So I would now like to introduce to you guys our wonderful presenter for today, the wonderful Kat Lavers. Kat is a passionate gardener and sustainable food systems advocate with a background in permaculture design, teaching, facilitation, and her work reconnects people with the land under their feet and helps them experience the abundance of food growing, as well as understand their role in a wider ecosystem, which is really important. And she's the gardener and designer behind the Plummery, an urban permaculture system producing almost all the veggies, herbs and fruit and eggs consumed by their household, which is pretty terrific to beat. And her wonderful house and site has been featured by so many publications, including Retro Suburbia, Gardening Australia, ABC Radio National Big Ideas, and also I believe has appeared in a film. And alongside her freelance work, Kat runs a sustainable gardening program at the Hobsons Bay Council, and is also a volunteer coordinator of Permablitz. So definitely the right expert to be delivering this workshop this morning. So I'd love if you could all join me in welcoming Kat to your screens, and I will hand over to you now, Kat.
Well, thank you so much, Beck, and good morning and welcome.
You haven't got your voice, Kat.
Oh, I'm definitely not on mute.
We do.
We do, great. So good morning, everyone, and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Thanks also to all the councils that are supporting this work to encourage food gardening at this really important time in our history. Before I say anything else, I just also want to acknowledge the land that I'm on today is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And it's just been amazing the last few years to learn more about the history of the way that this land was managed through the work of historians like Bruce Pascoe and Bill Gamage. And the understanding that is sort of emerging now is that the people who have cared and still care for this land are not just simple hunter-gatherers, but actually really farmers and gardeners, people who are doing agroforestry, aquaculture, all kinds of really sophisticated, clever, very carefully designed food producing systems. So it's this incredible heritage that we have in this part of the world. And obviously we'll talk about some different techniques and strategies today, but I just want to acknowledge that this land has really been managed so carefully to produce food for thousands upon thousands of years. And how exciting is it for us to be a part of that story as well. So as Beck said, I'm a home gardener. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. It's quite possible that there'll be people out there who have more expertise in some or maybe even all of the areas, let's be honest, that I'm talking about today. But I have been on a bit of an adventure with my own home garden, which we call the Plummery. This is a pretty typical suburban garden. It's a 1/14 of an acre, or about 280 square metres over in Northcote. And we started out with a goal to just have a go and see what was possible in a really small space, see what it could offer us for our food, and what we could offer it in terms of restoring the soil and bringing it back up to a really fertile, healthy state. And the results have been really exciting. So as Beck said, we are actually producing what more than I'd ever thought possible. And we do collect data on our food production, and the highest so far has been 428 kilos in 2018. and that's of herbs, vegetables and eggs and fruit, and a big small amount of mushrooms that we're starting to learn to grow as well. And so that's actually from about 100 square metres. It's a much smaller part of the block. Not all of it's productive yet. And on average, it's about maybe 4 hours of work a week, maybe 5 hours with the animals actually. But certainly for many people, a kind of achievable amount of time to be putting in. So it gives me great hope that it is possible to have these really productive systems in suburbia. So the goal and the purpose of today is knowing that there are a lot of new food gardeners out there as a result of the pandemic. People who are trying to stretch their household budget a little bit further, maybe avoid so many trips to the shops, or just have something to distract yourselves with and a place to relax at this time. There are lots of people who are starting gardening for the first time. And the intention, the purpose of this session is to really put together something that hopefully touches on all of the essentials. And by that, I'm going to talk about 5 particular areas. That will be designing your food garden. It'll be looking after your soil, getting your water right, a little bit on plants, and also, of course, a little bit on pests. So in the time that we've got, which is a little under 2 hours, we can't do anything in a lot of detail. So I just need to say that up front to you. Each of those sessions can easily be a 2 or 3 hour workshop in and of itself. But what I'm going to try and do is give you all the things that I wish someone had told me when I first started that would have saved me a lot of trial and error and a lot of time and failures. And hopefully you can step right over those and make some new and more interesting mistakes on your journey as food gardeners. So that's my goal today, but you will have to excuse me when I move along from some topics. And I know there are going to be a couple of questions that get left hanging that we can't cover. Partly because there's 146 of you right now in this meeting, which is very exciting, and partly because this is just an overview of those topics. But what we are going to be able to do is curate some questions. So at the end of each little chunk, Beck and Adriana are going to pull out the questions that most people seem to have, or the most popular questions, and we'll tackle those right there and then. If any of you have urgent questions after the session, I'm more than happy to stay as long as there are questions at the end for, you know, whatever it takes to get those answered. So I won't leave you with an urgent question today if I can help it. So we'll do that. As Beck said, I have some notes that are coming for you after the session. And more importantly, we've got other sessions as part of this series. So we're going to have a lot more detail on soil, on pests, and a bit on plant propagation as part of the Sustainable Living series. So for those sessions, I'm going to give you what I think is the most essential stuff right now. And then if you're able to join us for the other sessions, we can go into loads more detail and really do a kind of thorough unpacking of those topics. If any of you are quite experienced gardeners out there, I just want to say it's lovely to have you here. Please bear with us. The goal here is for beginners and to try not to leave anybody behind, and to not assume any previous knowledge or experience. If you've got great experience on a particular topic, please share that as well. The chat window is this amazing thing that can happen in online learning. So you can share your own advice, experience, you can share links and other resources with people, and that really makes a much richer session in my experience. So don't hold back. If you've got something that you'd like to contribute, or a tip or a technique, please just pop that in the chat window. And also, if you have experience which contradicts my experience, that's fantastic as well. So I've got one perspective, but people with different perspectives make it a much more interesting experience. So do feel free to put anything you like in that chat window if you'd like to contribute to the learning in the session as well. And so that's my little preamble. I think I'm going to get started now, and I'm going to share my screen just so I can pop some pictures in front of you. And I'll just ask Beck and Adriana if you can give me a thumbs up if it's working for you, or verbally let me know that that's working. And I'm going to take the time to pop my chat window up as well.
We've definitely got you, Kat.
Lovely. Okay, beautiful. Now the next challenge is, can I change the slide with my slide changer? Yeah, looks like I can. Okay, so I was going to start just by showing you a picture of my place when I started gardening. So it's a really typical bit of a rundown garden, lots of ornamental trees, lots of weeds, bit of lawn that wasn't even growing properly. And just as where you can go with food gardening, this is the garden a couple of years later, slightly different angle, and yes, taken on a very sunny, bright day by a friend who's a professional photographer. But it is quite possible to really radically transform these spaces in a fairly short period of time. And one of the things that makes me so excited about growing food in this part of the world is we've got a really mostly quite a gentle climate. We do have extremes of heat waves, but we can actually be pulling fresh fruit and vegetables out of our gardens every single day of the year. There are many parts of the world where the climate is harsh. You have a growing season and then you have to stop growing. There are some parts of the world where you have a metre of snow for large parts of the year. So imagine if you wanted to grow most of your own fresh produce, you'd have to grow a huge amount through the warmer months and then squirrel it away, which is a lot of work, and then pull it out through the winter. We don't have to do any of that in Melbourne. So we might as well take advantage of the climate that we've got and the potential that we have as well. So as I said, this is broken into 5 sections. And the first one I'm going to tackle is design. Now, I come from a permaculture background, and one of the principles that we talk a lot about in permaculture is patterns to details. And the intention behind patterns to details is we deal with the big picture, most important stuff first, and big decisions, and then we work our way down to the little ones. So we're going to start with how do we position our garden for maximum success before we get down to what do we plant in that veggie patch. And believe it or not, getting your design right saves you a whole lot of time and a whole lot of effort and problems down the track. If you put your garden in the wrong spot, you're going to have to work a lot harder to manage it and maintain it. You won't notice when things are ready to be harvested. You won't notice when caterpillars are there needing to be plucked off the leaf. So actually, although it's not so interesting as choosing plants, getting this design right is the first point that you need to tackle to have success. So here's a picture of our garden as an example. And this photo is taken with the camera in the north, so we're looking to the south. And one of the first things to think about when you're positioning your garden is where do you spend the most time on this property, and where is your kitchen specifically. And so if I pick up my virtual pen, I'll just draw a little star in red. Hopefully some of you can see that. And that's the door that leads through to the kitchen. So for us, it's just a few metres away. Contrast this with a really classic place to put a vegetable garden, at least in Melbourne, and that is right down the back of your garden, sometimes behind a screen where nobody can see it unless they intentionally walk down there. I wonder if some of you have a garden down there or know of people who put their gardens down the back. It's a bit of a classic in many cultures. But the issue with that, of course, is that you're just not going to have incidental surveillance of your vegetable patch. And that incidental noticing that happens when you put it right up front where you see it all the time can be the difference between working extremely hard to grow food and just nailing things because you happen to notice them in the course of your daily activities. So we often say the best place to put your veggie patch is where you would almost trip over it. I'm not encouraging you to create trip hazards, but put it somewhere where you can't help but notice what's going on. That's one of the first points of success. Next thing to talk about is wind protection. And we are going to talk about sun, of course, which is very important. But just while I've got this photograph in front of you, I'd like you to notice that the vegetable gardens that are in the centre actually are almost cocooned by fruit trees. So we've got a ring of fruit trees around them that are actually providing a bit of a wind buffer. And wind is a very underappreciated force. And what you'll find is if you, so let's say you are out there and you're feeling a bit parched and dry because there's a hot wind blowing through the garden, your plants are also going to be feeling parched and dry. And similarly in the winter, if you're shivering from a cold wind, you're actually going to find the vegetables are a little bit more stunted and not growing as tall and lush as you might expect. So if we can provide some kind of wind protection, whether that be from trees and shrubs, or if you're in a different context or you're renting from something like shade cloths, for example, or temporary screens, that's going to really, really help with the water use in summer and with the growth in the winter as well. And now, of course, we have to talk about sun. Everyone knows that sun is very important, but how much sun is the key thing to know in our climate especially. So in Melbourne, we've got these incredible summer heat waves where our temperature goes over 35 degrees for sometimes many days in a row. There's very little water around at that time of year. And what you do tend to read in a lot of gardening books and magazines is full sun. Your vegetables need full sun. Full sun, full sun, full sun. On all your seed packets, full sun. Plant labels, full sun. Now, the experience that many people have of full sun in Melbourne is that it's very difficult in the summer if you do have full sun on your vegetable garden. Veggies dry out, they burn. Sometimes the hot temperatures stop fruits like tomatoes from setting. So the advice that I have for people getting started is to find a spot where you have 5 to 6 hours of sun through the summer. And that is more than enough to grow fruiting plants and most vegetables. And that will ensure that you're not working extra hard to keep the water up to your garden, and the vegetables aren't getting as stressed as they would be if you had many, many more hours of sun. So 5 to 6 hours of sun is great, but in the winter, we need as much sun as we can manage. So it's a totally different situation at that time of year. And I've got a photo in front of you of our garden, slightly different angle, but same direction. And I'm hoping that you can see just how much the garden is opening out in the winter. So with this design, we've actually got the best of both worlds. We've got the summer, a bit of shade from those fruit trees, particularly in the afternoons when the sun is very hot. And then in the winter, the fruit trees all lose their leaves, and we get this really, really open garden that lets the maximum amount of sun in. So straight up, if you put your garden in a place where you've got a lot of shade in winter, you'll be able to grow some leafy greens, mince, parsley, but you are going to struggle with things like cabbages and other plants that need more sun. So find a spot that does get the winter sun. And if that's not totally possible, as much open sky as you can manage. Because on cloudy days, we actually have light bouncing around off the clouds. And so it actually makes it a little bit easier if you've got a spot that does have that open sky, even if you don't have full sun as much as possible. As I'm going through, by the way, feel free to pop questions in the chat window, and Beck and Adriana are going to curate them and bring out the most popular ones. So feel free to pop those in now so that we can catch them at the end of this session. Okay, so if you've got the sun right, then we can move on to the last point, which is just having an accessible water supply. And I know that's a bit obvious, but just so you've got the complete list of major factors in there, they're the things that I would pay a lot of attention to when positioning the garden. It's always a compromise between those. So it's often the case that you can't have all of them, in which case you'll have to make some decisions about what's most important. And probably sun and proximity to the kitchen will be the two determining factors for you in there. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is soil contamination, because this does have an effect on the way that you design your garden. I'm mostly going to be talking about leaded soil contamination here, which is the one that seems to be the biggest concern and the one we have the most research on that's available to us. Now, soil contamination is extremely common. I know this is a bit of a downer, and I'm going to teach you ways that you can get around this in a minute, but it helps to understand that so many things that we did in this before the 70s and 80s involved lead. So that was pretty much all house paint and petrol. Lead was used in flashing on roofs. It was used as a plasticizer and an additive in industrial processes, lots and lots of different things. So unfortunately, we have this legacy of lead in soil where people have lived during that period of time. If you've got children, it's particularly important that you're aware of lead because they're much more sensitive to it than adults, and it does have some neurological effects. So of course, it's a really good idea to know what the issue is in your area. And we have this incredible program now, VeggieSafe. It's one run by Macquarie University. VeggieSafe is offering hundreds of dollars worth of testing for about $20. So it's an incredible bargain, and it may not be there eventually because it's part of a research program. So I have the link for you in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen now. And I'd really encourage people who are considering staying put in that one area of land to get that soil tested so you know if it's a problem and you can deal with it. So lead, if you do have it, unfortunately you can't get rid of it. It's not like it breaks down into anything more benign because lead can't break down any further. But the good news is that we know it doesn't move around very much in soil. So it's concentrated where it was deposited, and it's likely to be not spreading much beyond that unless you're moving things like soil around. And there are some very important steps that we can take in order to make our gardens lead safe. One of the most important ones is actually keeping up your levels of compost and mulch. And we're going to talk about adding organic matter a little bit later. And we're going to talk about pH as well when we do the soil session. So just know now that if you keep your pH around the neutral mark, which is around pH 7 or slightly higher, that will really reduce the impact of soil transferring the lead through to plants. Now, we're extremely lucky that with fruiting plants, they typically have quite low levels of lead. So that means all of your existing backyard fruit trees, you know, the old plum that you've inherited, the old apricot tree. I just pause there because we've got a lot of background noise, and I'm wondering if I'm just going to mute. Oh, I'm wondering if Beck, if you can help me mute. Well, I've just muted someone. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so all those backyard fruit trees that you have are probably very safe for you to eat fruit from because the fruit doesn't tend to concentrate the lead. And that extends to fruiting vegetables like tomatoes, beans, pumpkins, and cucumbers. So if you do have soil that's got a low level of contamination, you can start growing those sorts of crops only, and that's one strategy. If you want to grow things like leafy greens and root vegetables, they actually take up higher levels of lead. And so it's important that we are really careful with growing those if you're eating from this soil over a long period of time. So for those sorts of things, the first thing would be definitely wash your vegetables and peel those root vegetables if there's lots of cracks and things that soil can get trapped in. And also prevent poultry from digging in that original soil, because of course poultry do inadvertently ingest a lot of soil and that can end up accumulating lead in their systems. Okay, and if you do end up with a fair amount of lead in there from the testing, you may need to bring in some fresh soil in order to grow some things like leafy greens and root vegetables safely. This is the reason why we've got raised vegetable beds at my place, and we've dealt with quite serious lead contamination in some parts of the block, and we did need to bring in soil into raised beds just to be really safe. But the good news is that it's not a barrier to growing food. It's just a really important design consideration that you need to know about in order to keep yourself safe. I also need to say that where I live, there are a lot of older, particularly Greek and Italian gardeners who are growing food in soil that must have a level of contamination, and they're living to a really, really healthy old age. So it's not something to panic about, but you do want to know about it so that you can take these sorts of design steps in order to keep yourself safe. Okay, so moving along, I wanted to show you some examples of different bed arrangements that you could think about. And I also want to be conscious that a lot of people are renting and in apartments and places where you can't set up a very permanent system. So the first photograph I want to show you is my friend Michael's place, which is a share house in Carlton. And he's spent very little money on setting up this garden. And most of it is built from scrap materials that he found in skips and hard rubbish. And it's a really, really productive and I think quite a beautiful little garden that's making the most of a very harsh concreted courtyard, which would be an absolute horrible place to spend time if it weren't for all these beautiful green plants. So one of the things to notice about this garden is the width of the vegetable beds. If you're starting out, the best width for a garden is one that you can reach all parts of it from a path. So you can see here that the beds are relatively narrow. They're limited to about 1.2 to 1.5 metres across, which is for most people the width that you can reach from each side and not have to step on the bed to access anything. So that's a nice tip, and that just means you can harvest easily, you can pull pests off easily, you can plant easily, and you don't have to step on that soil and compact it, which squashes the air out and leads to other issues that we'll talk about later. If you're getting started, it's a great idea just to start very small. So one of these beds or a couple of pots is absolutely enough. And a bit of a classic mistake is to start too much too soon and then not really monitor any of it very well and then get disappointing results and then decide to stop gardening. So to fight that, it's really good if you can have some self-control. It's very hard to take your own advice here, but actually start with a smaller area and then expand rather than the other way around. If your soil doesn't have any contamination and you've got good physical accessibility, you can move easily. If you're able to have beds that are in the existing soil, don't necessarily think that you need to raise them up. Raising up beds is going to be the most expensive, complicated, hard work part of setting up your garden. There's no reason why you can't grow food in your original soil unless there's something like a soil contamination issue. And also, this photograph is taken again from the north. So just looking at the way these beds are aligned, it's usually better if we have a north-south bed orientation, because that means that for taller plants in the beds, you'll get a nice even sun and you won't have, say, a large bed of tomatoes shading out the bed behind it, which you can have if they're an east-west orientation. Just thinking through which way around those beds will make the most sense in your patch. And you can, of course, turn unwanted materials into pots. So here are some great examples. One of them is from my place on the left, the other one is from Michael's place. And what I like about these pots is, firstly, you're turning a waste problem into a solution. Secondly, they're a really nice depth. So one of the tips for people getting started who are growing in pots is to make sure that you have at least about 30 centimetres of depth for most of your vegetables. If you have a shorter pot, what actually happens is you'll get dwarf plants in many cases, and they'll be very, very reliant on you for water and for food because the soil isn't like a big bank that they can draw from. So you're going to have to be watering those little pots sometimes several times a day in summer in order to keep the right moisture levels for many vegetables. So if you have a larger pot, you've got a bit more of a buffer. The plants are going to be larger, stronger, more resilient, and more productive. Something else to notice about these two pots as well is thinking about if you would ever have to move them, which one would you rather try and move? And thinking about the weight that you're going to have to shift in those pots. So a bathtub on the right is obviously extremely heavy when it's full of wet soil and plants. The pot on the left is about the maximum that two people can lift safely if you need to relocate your garden. So just encourage you, if you're renting, to think about that kind of scale. And this pot is about 30 centimetres or 40 centimetres deep and about 50 centimetres wide long and about 30 or 40 centimetres wide. So that's a good, safe, relatively portable pot for people who need them. Okay, something else as well is that although you can turn many things into pots, there's some materials that are not very stable when they're out in a garden environment. So if you have plastic that's not what we call UV stable, it's going to start to fracture and break down into small pieces, which of course creates another type of soil contamination that we don't want to add to. Humans are very, very good at contaminating soil. We're going to try not to add any more to that. So what I love here is this old recycling tub is very UV stable, and it is okay being in full sun for a lot of the year. I would watch out for anything that's been painted, because that paint will inevitably flake off and end up in your soil. And just any other materials like polystyrene, which can start to crumble over time. And of course, you might need to add drainage holes as well to some of these pots. The one on the right is actually a very special type of pot called a wicking pot, where you have a layer of water in the base that then the plants are able to drink up. I'm going to show you another example of those in a minute. And when you do have pots, a lot of the horticulture advice says that you should buy the best quality potting mix that you can find, which is probably the most expensive one, unfortunately. The other thing though is that I've been putting sandy soil in all of my pots, and although it goes quite contrary to all the conventional horticultural advice, I must say I have really, really good results with that sandy soil. And I treat both soil and potting mix the same as all of my garden beds. And when we come to looking at soil in a minute, you'll understand what that means. So you make your own choice, but I think if you've got sandy soil mix, you should be fine using that in pots as well. All right, so wicking beds and pots, I want to hone in on as a particular strategy for people who are particularly renting, and particularly in southeastern Australia, because one of the main growing limitations in our climate is of course that really scorching hot summer weather, which can dry pots out so quickly that you sometimes will need to be watering them daily, or sometimes even more than once a day if it's extreme weather. So what this wicking pot system does is it gives you a bit of a buffer, and those plants can just cope for longer because you've given them a glass of water that they can drink from whenever they need to take a bit of a drink. And this is a lovely example that's been made very cheaply out of a polystyrene broccoli box, which are being thrown out by markets all the time. These boxes are insulated, so the soil doesn't get quite so hot, and they're very light. The only disadvantage of them is some people are not comfortable growing food in polystyrene because of potential chemical transfer. There's not great advice on that, so you have to make your own decisions, but these are food grade boxes that had food products sold in them. And the other thing, unfortunately, is the polystyrene will break down eventually, but on the way to landfill, you are giving it some kind of useful life. And I can see somebody in the chat has, Sarah's just jumped the gun there on what I wanted to show you. So well done, Sarah. I want to show you a video of some friends of mine out in Altona who have done a particularly good job of setting up these wicking pots. So good, in fact, that Costa went to interview them. So I'm going to take a break for a minute and you're going to meet Rabea and Steve.
The great Australian dream. Buy a nice little house, maybe do it up a bit, work on the garden. But the reality is, heaps of people actually rent for life. So what does that mean for the gardening prospects of the 30% of Australians who are on a lease? No garden? Or pour all your love into the garden and then leave it behind when the lease ends? It's not like you can pick the garden up and take it with you. Or can you? We're about to meet a couple whose productive patch is totally portable.
From a small regional area near Holland.
Rabea and Steve are renting a unit in Altona in Melbourne's west. Rabea is expecting a baby in a month or so, and Steve has a broken shoulder. But despite all that, they've still got the energy to show me around. Well, I don't really need to ask where your place begins because I can sense that the food growing is happening right here.
Yep. Yes, it's a strong indicator.
Got to use all the space that we've got, basically.
If this is what you've got in the driveway, I want to see what's in the courtyard. Is this the right way?
Yep, that's the way.
Oh, so this is it. You've packed it full. I mean, there's not a lot of paver space. What sort of stuff are you growing?
We do love our teas. We have a lot of lemon balm and mint. We're trying a native mint as well. Beetroot in the corner there, and this year we're trying out eggplants, seeing how it goes here. Tomatoes are always beautiful to have, and some shallots growing here too.
This garden grows all of our salad greens, it grows all of our herbs, and we grow some of our vegetables from it as well. So around roughly about 50 kilos of produce.
And how big a footprint is the growing area?
If we were to take all these boxes and put them together, it'd be about 4 square metres.
4 square metres?
Yeah, 4 square metres, that's all.
You think about your average household, they've got a lot more than 4 square metres.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's a great example of productivity in a small space.
Yep, absolutely.
So you're growing a lot of it in containers.
Since we're renting, that's basically what we have to do because we can't really dig. But at the same time, it gives us a lot of flexibility.
You can take them with you when you move. So when you build up really good soil, you don't have to put in all that compost and all that effort and then you have to leave it behind, which is wonderful.
Now, my compost alarm is going off at the moment and the sensors are telling me that there's something going on over here in the corner.
Your compost alarm is correct. We have our composting system over here. It's completely portable. Costa, would you like to get in there and grab a bucket?
You got a second arm there. I still think you could have done it yourself.
So basically, with the buckets, we have some holes drilled up the top just to let air in, and we have some holes drilled at the bottom just for drainage. So as you can see here, that's some of our finished compost. Basically, the great thing is if you need to move house, you can easily take the whole system with you.
How much compost is your little system producing?
About half a tonne a year. And the great thing is that this system produces it in small amounts. So we obviously can't use half a tonne in one go here, so we can just use it as we need it.
A portable garden like this relies on a bit of upcycling and DIY. So it's time to head to the garage to see how it's done. So is this your secret workshop?
Yes.
Where all the
magic happens. So we're going to make a wicking bucket out of a 10 litre food grade bucket. Basically, a wicking bucket means that we don't have to water as often. So Costa, I'm going to need you to do some drilling for us.
Yeah, no worries.
So basically here we've got agricultural poly pipe. We pre-made this where we use a little barbed irrigation joint. You can dip the ends of the poly pipe in boiling water, which just makes the pipe more malleable, a bit easier to hit over this barbed joint. So 3 holes, 1 inch apart. This will sit inside the bucket just here, almost 2/3 of the way across the bucket, just to help spread the water out a bit more evenly.
All right, so the next step is to make a drainage hole. This will then go in here, but we need to make a hole for that first.
It's 25 mil, which is just a little bit smaller than the poly pipe we're going to use.
And that makes a nice snug fit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, that looks really good.
Yeah?
Thanks.
No worries.
We need to make little slits here. It feeds it through nicely. So now you can push it through here.
Yes.
Here we go.
The next step now is that we put the filler pipe in. The aim is to have the filler pipe about 90 degrees from where the front pipe is. It just makes it easier when you're filling them up. And here we've got some scoria, so it's just there to stop the soil from working its way into the water reservoir. But it's volcanic rock, it's nice and hollow. So even with the scoria inside, this can hold 2 litres of water. So we're going to put that in.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have enough scoria so it's just at the top of the drain pipe.
So covering to the high side.
That's right.
Next step is we put a weed mat in it so the soil doesn't get mixed up with the scoria. I suppose when you find your plant outgrows this side of bucket, you can ideally, lift the soil out in one go and then move it into a new one. Yeah.
Great idea.
The next step would be to put the soil in together with the compost.
So how many times have you moved this portable setup?
Well, we moved it, like the whole garden, we moved once last year when we moved into this unit here. But I guess we move the buckets around quite frequently. If, the weather changes, the sun changes and so on, we just pick it up and move it.
What do you reckon?
Yeah, that's pretty
That
good.
was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What do you want to plant in this one?
Oh, I reckon parsley.
Yep, we could use parsley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And what number is it? How many of these have you got now?
I reckon this is number 40.
So you'll be able to take number 40 with you if ever you move.
Yeah, all 40 of them.
Yeah.
So I hope you enjoyed that video. Pretty inspiring couple, folks. And they tell me that they've only been really seriously having a go at gardening since 2018. So just to give you a sense of how quickly you can start to have great results, I think they're just a wonderful example for all of us. So if you missed that, they are growing most of their herbs, herbal teas and greens with just 4 square metres of space, and all really from upcycled materials and things that they've found. And did you see that compost? My goodness, it's like the best looking compost I've ever seen in my whole life. And it's just tucked away under a shrub in their courtyard. So for anyone who thinks that they might be struggling to find space, I think, yeah, this garden says it all for me. Okay, so I'm going to pause there before we move on to soil. And just a reminder, we do have sessions on soil and water, a bit on plants and pests coming up. So I'll just ask Beck and Adriana if they could funnel me some of the most popular questions relating to design.
Yeah, definitely. There are a few about pots and vertical gardening. I think maybe we kind of touched on it. But someone's asked about like growing plants with invasive roots in pots, and if you'd recommend, keeping raspberries and other fruit with invasive roots in bathtubs and pots.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great use for pots. Plants that tend to spread, especially raspberries that just pop up everywhere and of course are quite thorny in many cases. Plants like mint, plants like Jerusalem, artichokes, yeah, they're all very good to confine to pots.
Farah's asked if vertical gardening is a long-term food growing solution for those with limited space. So I guess a bit about how much you can really grow vertically.
Definitely, and I'm going to touch on that later, but definitely using vertical space. And actually, the thing that Rabea and Steve haven't done yet is really use the most of the walls in this little courtyard area that we're looking at. And many plants like climbing tomatoes versus dwarf tomatoes, or climbing beans versus dwarf beans, they'll yield about 2 to 3 times as much with the same footprint in terms of 2D space. So it is really, really worth thinking about how to use any of these fences or even washing lines, poles, trellises, anything you can find that grows up. Yeah, really, really good point. I'm glad you've raised it.
There was a question around, I think it was that old waste tub that you had, if you added extra holes in, or if you just went with the holes that were in there.
Yeah, the old black recycling tubs come with some drainage holes, and we haven't found the need to add any more to them. But if you do have a tub that holds water, then you will actually need to put some drainage holes in, or turn it into a wicking box like Rabea and Steve have done here, where you don't have drainage holes, you have one overflow hole just to stop the box from flooding with water when it rains heavily.
Dimi had a question, and I'm not exactly sure. He's asked about veggie pots, he or she. Do you know what a veggie pot is? Is that like a type of...
A veggie pot is a commercial pot system for growing food. So, and I've seen a couple of links that people have been putting in, so thanks for those. It's good to know what people are using out there.
Fran has asked, is it true that you can grow beans on both sides of, for example, chicken wire?
Oh, okay. And yeah, we will come to plants briefly a bit later on. Yes, you could. So that really comes down to spacing, and each of these plants needs to have enough root area to get the essential nutrients and water that they need. So it's less about the space above ground and more about the space in the bed, as long as they've got somewhere that they can climb up. So for example, when I grow beans that climb up a pole, I'll have one pole and I'll let 2 bean plants grow up it. And they've got enough space at the bottom in the soil, and then as long as they can physically get their leaves out somewhere to catch sun, happy days.
Cool. There was a question from Halsey, she was just asking about pallets or using them for stacked garden beds or raised beds. Are they safe in terms of leaching?
Yeah, there's lots of different types of pallets out there. And pallets, of course, are the things that we get all these goods imported into the country on. And some of them are not safe and some of them are safe. And there's a stamp that they put on the ones that have been treated with heat only. You can look up what that stamp looks like. It sometimes says HT for heat treated. So those are the ones to look out for. And with anything that you scavenge and bring back to your garden, just be really aware of contaminants. And of course, treated timbers are one of the main offenders here. And so again, just make sure that you have things that are treated with heat only if you're going hunting for pallets.
And I might go to one question just about sunshine. So Sita says her garden, he or she's garden has intense sun all year round. Do you have any tips on protecting the plants in the summer?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. And as I said before, just having some shade on the garden and wind protection as well, using old sheets, using shade cloth, or using deciduous trees if you are more permanent in that position are really good ways to protect. And I will come back to heat waves a little bit later on.
Cool.
Might need to move on, Beck. Is that okay?
Yeah,
I know that there's a few more questions out there, but we can catch them up at the end if they're not covered by the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about composting and soil. So I think a lot will be covered.
Well, let's move on then to improving your soil. Now, as I said at the start, patterns to details. So I know many people are really, really keen to get onto plants and to get onto pests. But often when people say, what's wrong with my plant? The answer really comes back to the soil. So it's the classic organic gardening advice, just look after your soil and the rest takes care of itself. It's almost always got a root somewhere in what's happening underground. So it's really important that we start to grapple with what this soil stuff is and how we can take great care of it. So here's my soil. I love this stuff. I love introducing people to it as well. You get to know it really well when you're gardening over time, and you get to watch how it changes over time and how it improves, how the texture transitions throughout the season. And it's really, really complicated stuff. But luckily, the way that we keep soil fertile and healthy is surprisingly simple and surprisingly consistent, no matter what type of soil you've got or even what climate you're in. There are some things that soil responds to universally, and that's really, really good news for us because it takes a lot of the complexity out when we're trying to work out what to do. So good fertile soil tends to be darker. It tends to be crumbly and have crumbs and chunks in it rather than one uniform solid mass or a handful of sand, if you like. And it's also quite spongy, and that sponginess allows it to hold water, sometimes really considerable amounts of water, and also hold on to nutrients as well. And a lot of us don't even really know what soil is. So if you were to break it apart into components, we'd find that there's a mix of minerals. So these are things like sand, silt, and clay, which are probably familiar words to you. So we have different ratios of those, which give us different soil textures. And then we have other parts, which are water and air, and something called organic matter. And the organic matter turns out to be probably the most important part of keeping soil healthy, but it's actually one of the smallest components in soil. It's only about 5 or 10% in a healthy soil. If your soil's neglected and unhealthy and not very fertile, it'll be sometimes very low, 1 or 2% organic matter. So the way that we improve the fertility of soil is getting this balance of water and air and organic matter right again. So no surprises, we're going to really hone in on those three. And one thing I hear a lot from people is, oh, my soil's terrible, I'm going to have to get some more soil in, buy some more soil and bring it into my block. And the good news is that you really shouldn't need to bring in more soil unless you've got an issue like lead contamination, because there isn't on a small scale a way to clean that soil of the lead. But if you've just got unhealthy, unfertile soil, we can change that, and we can change that really quickly. So I wanted to show you an example from my place in the very first garden that we built here. Just looking at the moment, hopefully you look at that and instinctively go, that's not super fertile, because it looks very different to this type of soil that I'm holding in my hand. I want to show you what we've done very quickly with this soil. We've used a technique called no-dig gardening. And this is before, by the way, we did the raised beds. So this is using the original soil that we first inherited when we moved in. I wasn't very good at taking photos then, so apologies, they're all a bit dull and a bit blurry. But what we've done here is right over the top of that lawn, we've started building a garden. And there's a couple of steps here. Actually, the first step, which is a bit surprising, is you fertilise the lawn. You go, wow, why would you want to do that and give all those weeds and grasses that you don't want more food? And the answer is that what you're trying to do is stimulate them all into growth and then suffocate them, or rather smother them and prevent them from getting light with a really thick overlapped layer of newspaper and or cardboard. Now, just to pause for a second, if you're starting with some lawn which has got a very tough, drought-tolerant, hardy grass that has lots of rhizomatous shoots or kind of thick stems that are running horizontally along the ground, such as couch or kikuyu grass, they're still going to break through. So unfortunately, if you've got those grasses, the organic way of dealing with them is to get everybody over to your place, which is hard at the moment, I acknowledge. Give them all a shovel or a fork or a spade and ask them to help you dig out as much of that as possible before you continue with these steps. Because those grasses are just so tough that they're not going to be bothered by the layer of newspaper or cardboard. They'll just break straight through them and continue. I had some couch grass that ate a couch at a previous rental house that I used to live in. Grew up all the way through the cushions, totally enveloped the couch. We had a grass couch that we used to sit on. So extremely tough, great drought tolerant grasses for a lawn. Super competitive if you're growing vegetables. So really want to try and keep grasses and veggies away from each other so that we can get the most value out of the nutrients and the water that we're adding. So anyway, back to no-dig gardens. We are smothering them with this layer of newspaper and cardboard. We're going to make sure the newspapers... Mold remover from both. We're going to mute a couple of people. Just check you're on mute, folks, so we don't get background noise. So we're going to smother them with a thick layer of newspaper and cardboard, making sure that there's no gaps. The overlap is about 10 or 15 centimetres, and wetting it down so that it almost becomes like a paper mache layer that really does stop plants from weeding their way through. And then on top of that, what you can see us doing in the photograph is adding these layers of nitrogen and carbon-rich materials. So nitrogen-rich materials are things like animal manures. We've got some horse poo here from local stables. You might have other types of like cow manure or sheep manure. We could also have green leaves and grass clippings, those sorts of things in this layer. You can see actually in this photograph that we've started to cut down some of the ornamental shrubs in the garden, and all of those leaves are actually getting put into the no-dig. So we can actually make use of all those as resources using this technique. And then we're going to layer up carbon materials. Carbon materials could be things like shredded newspaper and cardboard, preferably without any shiny glossy inks to them. And then things like wheat straw are great in here. Autumn leaves, those lovely dry leaves that are blowing around many Melbourne streets at the moment are perfect. I can see Amy said, can you put eucalyptus leaves in? Probably not immediately, Amy, but if they've sat in a pile for a long time and they're not smelling richly like eucalyptus anymore, then you could definitely put them in. You just need to let them leach away some of those oils, which are quite antagonistic to soil bacteria. And then they should be fine to put in. And definitely not cat or dog poo. So I'm seeing a few people saying, we're going to talk about those sorts of nutrients in our soil session next week, but cat and dog poo and other carnivore poo, we're definitely not going to use those in food producing systems. Chicken poo, Lily, will be quite okay. And comfrey, Vanessa's just mentioned, is a plant that is really rich in nitrogen, also really excellent in here. So we're going to build up these layers. just like a lasagna, basically, layer of carbon, layer of nitrogen. We're going to finish with a layer of carbon on the top, so we don't get any smelly manure or anything like that affecting us. And then we've basically got a garden bed that's ready to plant. And the beautiful thing about this system is you can actually plant into it straight away. So you just reach into the layers, push them aside a little bit, make a little pocket, and with that you just put a few handfuls of soil or compost in there, and you can plant those seedlings straight away. And you can even get away with large seeds like peas and beans. Those little ones are going to get lost, but you can put those large seeds in there straight away. So this photograph is the very first veggie patch that we made within months of moving into this house. Excuse all the mess around the side. But yeah, this is what we set up. And I'll just do a before and after now for you. So that is the garden. And this is literally 2 or 3 months after we planted it, and we're harvesting straight away. And check out some of the broccoli that we grew from that really unenthusiastic looking soil. We go straight away to excellent production. So this is quite a powerful technique if you want to use the existing soil, if you want to bring it back to health and get it cracking pretty quickly and easily. I will just give you a word of warning though, no dig does not mean no effort, and there's an awful lot of hauling that goes in to bringing all these materials in. So just keep that in mind. It's not necessarily a lazy gardener's approach. It is actually still a fair bit of work, but you have the advantage of using this soil straight away and bringing it back to health remarkably quickly in just a few short weeks. All right, so soil's an incredibly complicated topic, and I'm going to struggle to even get through the basics of it in our session that we've got coming up after this one. But if I were to summarise the absolute essence of keeping your soil healthy, the key message here is we need to keep adding organic matter. Organic matter is anything that's lived before: leaves, twigs, manures, although just coming back to that point, we don't use cat or dog manure in food gardens because of the possible risk of pathogen transfer. But animal manures like chicken manure, cow manure, sheep manure, guinea pig manure, rabbit manure, if you've got those animals at home, all those things are types of organic matter. And as gardeners, usually we'll put them on as compost and or as mulch. What we're doing when we're adding compost is mimicking what happens in more natural systems where plants grow, then they drop some branches, or sometimes they die, and then they rot back down, and then new things spring up in their place. And what we're trying to do is mimic that by making sure that that cycling is always happening. And the key point for people getting started is this is not something that you add once. This is something that needs to be continually added because it gets used up. This is what our plants use to form their tissues and to grow. So when we take them away, we're also taking away that nutrient, and then we need to keep constantly replacing it. I can see Lily said, is this something that you're adding between seasons or as the veggies grow? You can actually do both, Lily, but I find it's easiest just to add it before I plant again. Or for things that are perennial, that are staying in the ground for more than one season, like fruit trees, then I'll be adding it around them when I've got it throughout the year. And Angela, can I add cut lawn grass to plants? Yes, you can. Grass is very nutritious. It often clumps together, so you don't want it as a big thick layer if it's getting all slimy, but it's great mixed in with leaves or straw. And you just want to make sure there's none of those bits of rhizomatous grasses like couch and kikuyu in there, because they're going to take off and take over. So anyway, organic matter, adding organic matter is pretty much the most important advice for keeping your soil healthy. So keep that in mind. And I thought I'd show you a picture. This is from a few weeks ago when I just planted my autumn and winter veggies. One of the questions that eluded me initially when I started growing food was, okay, I need to add compost, but how much do I add? And that was a hard question to find the answer to. So after a lot of trial and error at home and checking this out with lots of friends of mine who are now market gardeners, the rough rule of thumb is that you'll need 1 to 2 inches or about 3 to 5 centimetres of compost across the entire surface of the bed every time you plant annual vegetables, and need to keep doing that for some time until those organic matter levels are quite high. And it certainly won't hurt to continue it indefinitely. So that's quite different to just adding a sprinkling of compost, which is what I used to do. It's a serious thick layer across the whole surface of the bed, because those roots, of course, will spread out everywhere. So the plant needs fertile soil everywhere. You also need to keep adding mulch in our climate just to maintain that soil moisture and try and get a more consistent temperature for your plants. So almost all year I've got a layer of mulch, including in winter. And I might scrape it away to plant seeds, and I might scrape it away in springtime just to let a little bit of sun hit the soil and start warming it up a bit faster. But yeah, mulch, there's a bit of research on mulch now, and they say about 7 centimetres is good. And that's a fairly specific number, I know, but it's trying to get a balance between letting some rain actually get into your soil when it rains, rather than just get trapped in that mulch layer, and then enough mulch to keep that moisture in the soil when it wants to evaporate. So roughly 7 centimetres of mulch is a nice in between. And the other important piece of advice on mulch, which I won't really have time to explain today, but just know that we don't use wood chips on vegetable gardens. So keep wood chips for things like fruit trees and perennials. And for your vegetables, go for nice soft mulches, like straw, for example, or even shredded paper if you're doing things on the cheap. Or what I've done here is actually cut down my previous season's crops, and that was zucchinis and cucumbers in this bed and beans, and just leave them on the surface as mulch for your next crop. That's a really simple, easy way of cycling that organic matter around. Okay, so I'll move on from mulch now. Actually, no, I won't. Just a quick message on mulch. People go, what's the best type of mulch? And it really depends on where you are in Australia and in the world. My criteria are that it's free and it's locally sourced, so it hasn't had to travel long distances, and it's preferably not packaged and wrapped in plastic. So for me, the most sustainable choice of mulch, I'll play you this daggy video, is these gorgeous autumn leaves, which are currently dropping around the leafy suburbs near where I live. So we spend 1 hour with a rake, that's 2 people, 1 hour and a rake, and we can collect enough of these leaves to do all of our mulch, all of our composting all year round, by stuffing them into some barrels and saving them for later. So look out for sources near you. Try not to get things like sugarcane mulch, which are wrapped in plastic and trucked down from Queensland if you're in Melbourne. Just use what you've got around you to best effect. I know, Natalie, you're asking about fertilisers. I don't have a lot of time to talk about them today, but I do often add about a handful per square metre of something that's quite rich in nitrogen, which could be a poultry manure, or it could be something like blood and bone, or a pelletized organic fertiliser if you need to buy them in. Okay, so I said at the start of the soil session that the keys to soil fertility are getting the organic matter right, they're getting the air right, and getting the water right. So we're going to move now to aerating your soil, and the simplest way that we can do this is actually getting in there with a garden fork and just gently loosening your soil. What you're trying to do is make sure that it's easy for roots to get nice and deep in the soil, and that you can get air in there, which the plants actually need to absorb as well, and also water. We don't want a situation where water is landing, or this precious rainfall is landing and just running away. So if we can just break the soil open and loosen it, and that's one way that we can help water get nice and deep into the soil. So keep your eyes on the screen. I've got a really fast video to show you that I will replay. This is just showing you the technique for using a garden fork to simply and hopefully quite easily and comfortably loosen and aerate your soil. Yeah, it's very fast. This is pulled from a YouTube clip of an urban farmer called Curtis Stone over in North America. Oh, sorry, let me just go back. Play it one more time. There you go. So you can see he's just fluffing the soil. He's not working hard to turn it over or necessarily digging it. He's just fluffing it and breaking it open and loosening it. So that's just a simple technique. That's what I do at home. And yeah, that just helps all those good things to happen. And I can see Amy's put in a question about if you've got raised beds, do you still need to aerate? And what about if the beds are high off the ground? Yes, I'd say you do, Amy. So you can get compacted soils just as easily in a raised bed as you can in a ground level bed. Hopefully you're not stepping on them. And of course, stepping on your beds is really bad news because it undoes all the lovely aeration. But yeah, I definitely jump up on my raised beds and aerate them. If that is a bit dangerous for you, you could try doing that from ground level. But it's often a bit harder work because you're using your arm muscles rather than your body weight, as we see in this picture. All right, I'm going to pause for a second there before we move on to watering and just check the most common questions that are coming through for soils. Thanks, Beck.
Yes, here I am. There are a couple of questions about eggshells and coffee grounds and using them.
Sure. Yeah, both of them are obviously forms of organic matter. So they're good to be cycling around and adding to your soil. There is some research that coffee grounds can actually inhibit plant growth if they're used in too high a concentration. And that's particularly a problem if they're not composted. So the best thing to do with things is usually compost them first, and that degrades any kind of plant inhibiting chemicals. And then they're absolutely perfectly fine. If you're going to use coffee grounds straight, I would just make sure they're not used too excessively and keep an eye on the plant growth. So often I do little experiments at home where I'll try one thing on one half of the bed and leave the other half and see what the difference is. You can do these little mini science experiments all the time and just work out whether or not it's the right amount for your plants. They're definitely good resources to be using. And I actually hear quite regularly people telling me they use eggshells and coffee grounds to reduce slugs and snails from eating their seedlings. So you might be able to use them and get some other benefits as well.
Yeah, thank you. One from Jacqueline has asked about sawdust and if it's okay to go in the garden.
Yeah, sawdust, another great organic matter source. It's often used for paths. It's quite nice having sawdust paths, although they can track into your house if you don't take your shoes off first. Definitely makes great compost. And in fact, Rabea and Steve's compost that you saw in those buckets, they use sawdust as a dusting over the top of their food scraps to balance out that nitrogen. So perfect in compost. Yeah, not usually the sort of thing that you would mix through soil, and you usually wouldn't use that as a mulch because it's very woody. And again, I'm not going to go into the science of this, but we try not to use very woody mulches on vegetables because it can diminish growth. Come back in the soil session, I'll explain why that is. And I've just seen Amy say, do you need to worry about the sawdust from treated wood? Yes, absolutely. Don't use any treated timbers. Don't use any varnished timbers, any plywood, any of those engineered wood products. Great. Anything else, Beck?
There was just one about, I think, Sarah has asked about aerating when you have planted and have established plants. Can you wreck the roots, I guess, through aeration?
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, look, I gently tickle around those plants sometimes. I'll just slowly work the fork in and just give them a tiny little nudge to aerate them. But yeah, you don't want to wreck roots of established plants. So I mostly am using that around areas that I've cleared. Yeah.
I might just add just about the soil session next week. If you can't make it, but you're really interested, still register for the session because we will be like this one recording it, and you will then get the email with the recorded link and you'll be able to watch it in your own time. So yeah, I will send a link after this email and that will have a link to next week's session.
Awesome. Thanks, Beck. What I think we might do is I'm going to do a tiny bit on watering now, and then we'll have a short break and we can all go refill our cups of tea or coffee or chosen beverages. And I can, in that time, maybe catch a few more questions. So let me just do a tiny bit on watering so I know we've got that done. And then we'll have that little break that we promised. So watering, as I said, is also key to soil health and fertility. And that's because soil is actually alive. It's full of billions of bacteria and fungi and protozoa and nematodes and microarthropods, all these incredible creatures that you'll probably never meet face to face. You just have to take my word for it that they're there, they're in the soil. And like all living creatures, they need moisture as well. Plants also need the moisture, obviously so they don't wilt, but also because they draw in their nutrients in a solution, like drinking them through a straw. So watering is just so key to getting results. And I know it seems like a very, very obvious point, but it's just so important that I had to put it in words. It does take water to grow food. So if you're really stingy with water in your food garden, you are going to have disappointing results for most common vegetables. And to illustrate that, this photograph shows you some carrots that I grew. They're exactly the same variety of carrot in the same bed, planted at the same time. And the only difference, that even in the same row, the only difference between the top and the bottom is the ones on the bottom were on the edges of the raised bed, and those ones didn't get good, even moisture, and they were periodically drying out. So that just shows you what happens when you water properly. And I get asked a lot about what do you think about companion planting? What do you think about biochar? What do you think about adding mycorrhizal fungi and rock dust and lots of other gardening additives and products that are on the market? And some of them have good value in some circumstances, but when people are looking for a breakthrough in productivity and not having the results that they expect, and they think, oh, maybe I need this product and then it's going to be better. I reckon that if everybody learned how to water really, really well, we'd actually not care about those things because we'd be having the good results that we want most of the time. So water is kind of a breakthrough thing, and although it's not very sexy, I really like to spend time on it and encourage people who are getting started growing food to learn how to do it well. Okay, so let's talk about that. So I spend a lot of time sort of informally interviewing my friends who grow vegetables for a living. And one of the things I ask all of them at some point is, how do you know whether your crops need water? And it's very reassuring that the technique that I've been using for many years is what all the professionals do. And the consistency in their reply gives me a lot of confidence that this is really the best advice and there's nothing more to it really. And that is just using your finger as a guide. So all you need to do is poke your finger down into the root zone. So for vegetables, you're going to go probably as deep as you can push it, about 15, 20 centimetres. For fruit trees, maybe it's a little bit deeper. And we want to be feeling that soil, touching it, and trying to work out whether it needs water. And the guide for me is I want it to feel a little bit cool, and I want it to feel damp, like a kitchen sponge that you've just wrung out in your hand. So a little bit of dampness there. And most of the time your fingers should come out a bit dirty, like my finger has here. So if your finger comes out completely clean, often that indicates there's not much moisture in that soil. So it's a pretty simple tip. Just start poking your finger into soil and noticing whether it's got a dampness to it. And you'll find that that might change in different parts of your veg. And of course it changes throughout the year. One of the big surprises for me when I started growing food was realizing that I actually have to water in winter, even if there's moisture sometimes on the leaves of plants. So it can really trick you because you see moisture on the ground, on the surface, you can see little bubbles of rain on the leaves, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the water is getting down to the roots. So you'll find your vegetables don't grow as well over winter, and sometimes when you turn the beds over in spring, you can find incredibly dry soil and you go, oh, well, that's why I didn't have very good cabbages this year. So that's the trick, just start doing that. And I can give some general advice on watering in Melbourne, but it's going to be so context specific that your best advice is going to come just from continually monitoring that soil moisture. I can see a couple of questions that, can you water vegetables, over water vegetables, and what if it's too wet? And the answer is yes, you can overwater vegetables. If you overwater them, you start taking up all of the airspace in the soil, which leads to other problems, and some plants will get sick and die. And if you water too much, you actually leach nutrients out of the soil. Some nutrients dissolve in water, and if that water is not being taken up by plants, the nutrient just slowly drains away, and the plants are going to have nutrient deficiencies. So don't water too much, but do just try and maintain that soil moisture. And in our climate in Melbourne, we tend to have not enough water rather than too much. Most places, most of the time. It's not a universal rule. Okay. Second tip with watering is make sure you're watering the soil, not the plants. So on the left is how I used to water. So you're kind of spraying water everywhere. On the right is how I try and water now. So that's hose right down close next to the soil, ideally keeping the leaves dry. And there's two reasons for that. One of them is, of course, if you've got wet leaves, that water is wasted and it's not getting to where it's most needed in the soil. The second reason is that wet leaves on some plants will contribute to fungal diseases like powdery mildew and other types of mildew. And that's particularly a problem if the plants are planted quite closely, as they often tend to be in my garden. And so we want to avoid those issues as much as we can. So we're going to water the soil, not the plants. Of course, we often have water restrictions in Melbourne, so I'm going to encourage you to follow them. They're very important. Usually they'll guide you towards watering early or very late in the day, and that's a good thing, because if we're watering in the middle of the day, a lot of that water in summer ends up evaporating and not being used by our plants. It's also quite unpleasant standing out there when it's 35 degrees and the sun is bearing down on your back. So try and stick with those water restrictions and make sure you're watering not during that heat of the day. And the third tip, and one of the most important ones, to be honest, is while you're watering, keep doing those finger checks, because it's actually quite shocking when you start doing it. You can water for a long time and just poke your finger in and realize that it's still really dry, even quite close to the surface. Soil can hold an impressive amount of water. It's basically a water tank. And so we really want to know that water is getting right down where it's needed. And that often means you need to stand there with a hose for almost a disturbing amount of time when you're starting out, get that soil moisture up to a good level, and then keep topping it up. But you'll learn this most easily if you just keep touching the soil and sticking your finger in and working out where the water's going. Okay. Some tips for heat waves. If you're someone who's growing in pots, those wicking pots are gold that we looked at before. If you don't have wicking pots though, there are some ways that you can also have good moisture levels without too much work. And this is what I do for some of my pots. I've got this little saucer down the bottom, and I've actually picked most of these up from the side of the road when people chuck them out, but you can buy them if you want to. And these are really deep saucers, about 5 centimetres deep. And on a really hot day, when I know 35 degrees or more is coming, then I'll water the plant until that saucer is just about to overflow. And it's like a wicking bed, but it's on the outside of the pot. And that means that that plant can drink up all that extra water when it needs it. And I find if I do this, the plant gets through those 35 degree days, no problems at all, with only one watering, which is good, and obviously good production results. And if you don't want to do this, there's another trick someone taught me in a workshop like this, and that is to bury an ice cream container at the bottom of your pot. And that effectively works like a wicking box. It's just one that you can take apart. So if I do a little diagram for you on the right hand side here, you've got your pot. Hopefully it has some drainage holes somewhere in the base, if it's a normal pot. And we're just burying any kind of ice cream container or other plastic container in the soil, and then treating it like a normal pot with your plant roots. And what that means is when you water, there is going to be some water that gets caught in here, and it's going to fill up and stay there, and it'll be soggy, saturated soil. And then as the plant needs it, it can drink out of that soil moisture zone and slowly, just come back to normal growth. Mary, I can see you say, do you empty the sources in wetter weather? Yeah, you don't need them through wet weather, so you could take them away if they're full of water and the plant's not using them. But mine is still out there now, and we are having a lot of rain at the moment, but we're still having some gaps where there's no good rain for a week or so, and I haven't necessarily felt the need to remove them yet, but you absolutely could. And Emma, the drainage actually still will happen even if you've got the ice cream container there. Water's very good at leaking out of pots, so I haven't had too many issues. If you were worried though, you could put some chunky gravel in the bottom. Mosquitoes will only be a problem if the water sits there for longer than a week. So that would be my cue if I started to see that, to stop watering so much or to remove these sources if they were becoming an issue. Okay. All right. Finally, on heat waves, this is one of the things that you'll see if you come to my place during summer and it's going to be really hot weather. So we make sure that the soil moisture is really good, and then we'll actually put some sunscreen over our plants. And this is what our sunscreen looks like. Some old bed sheets sewed together if you need to make them easier to put over, and we'll just peg them or weight them down. And I find that the plants absolutely sail through hot weather if they've got this protection. It is a fair bit of work, but it's really worth it for the production. So this means that you get healthy plants that are still growing strongly rather than plants that are really, really stressed and struggling to recover over the summer. So I think I will pause there on watering and take a few more questions from Beck. You're on mute, Beck.
Thanks, Kat. A question about how often you water. Is that an easy one to answer?
Of course, this really depends on where you are. So I'm always a bit cautious about giving these broad brushstroke rules of thumb. But for me personally, I find that in my raised beds, I probably need to do at least 2 decent waterings a week through summer. I do have some drip irrigation, but I still water by hand because I find the drip irrigation is a little bit patchy. So yeah, at least twice a week of really decent watering in summer, daily if we're having extreme hot weather. And then over the really cooler months in winter, like about now, I might need to water in an average year once every 10 days or something like that. This year, of course, we're having a lot of rain, which is incredible. And so it's nothing like that. But I definitely still need to top up the water sometimes in the cooler weather as well.
Cool. A couple of questions about wicking beds. Do you water wicking beds differently?
Yeah, you do. And with the wicking beds, you've got that reservoir in the bottom. And what you'll do to water them is actually fill that up until you start seeing water coming out the overflow hole. And that will tell you that that reservoir is full. And that water actually wicks up through the bed, gets drawn up a bit like a piece of paper in a bowl of water would start to draw that moisture up. It gets drawn up through the soil, and that's how those get watered. And the only exception to that is if you've just put in seedlings or if you've just put in seeds, you will need to water those from the top until they're established. Now, the great thing about wicking beds and pots is people who've got them are telling me they can only fill them up once a week for most of summer. And so that's pretty amazing compared to the amount of time that I spend out there watering my veggies. So for people who don't have much time, for people who take long summer holidays, people who don't want to be spending that time outside watering in summer, wicking beds and pots are really quite a good technique. But they're not the only way of growing food, and you can definitely have a water efficient garden without them, as I do. But yeah, they are one good option that I like to talk about for people.
One from Ali. How do you prevent plants from flooding when it's non-stop raining? Is that an issue?
Yes, it depends on your soil type and the topography of your garden. If you know flooding's a problem, then you might need to raise the beds up using something like what I've got in front of you here. And so mounding the soil up and having mounded beds is how you would solve those sorts of drainage issues. Or you could install some subsurface drain pipes to help move that water away from your vegetables. Yeah. Beck, I think we might need to pause there and have our break as promised. I'm going to ask if it is okay to have it as quite a short break because we do have a little bit more that I want to get to. So it is 11:33 now. So I'm going to ask if we can come back at 11:40 and then we'll continue with the session. And if anyone wants to ask more questions during that break, I'm very happy to stay put.
Thanks, Kat. We'll see you all in about 7 minutes.
Beck, are there any more questions on that list that you'd like to throw me?
Yeah, there are quite a few.
Or should we consider the questions that people just want to ask right now so we don't miss anyone who's gone?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. Maybe we can just refer directly to the chat box, and if you've got a burning question, just re-type it in the chat box and we'll address it.
Lovely.
Hey Kat, this is Fran. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi, Fran.
Hey, in regards to the roots, so naturally, obviously the plant roots go with the center being the plant and then outwards in a circle. I wonder if it's okay also to have the roots just growing one way, especially when you design your patch. Would that work too?
Oh, so do you mean, like, how would you control that, Fran? Can you paint me?
Yeah, so I was the one who asked the question with the beans. So I have my beans on both sides of the chicken wire, and obviously they can't grow like that because then there would be too much overlap. So I kind of force them to grow that way, and I wonder if that could be an issue for the plant growth.
Yeah, I think, Fran, that's fine. I do that as well. The key is just overall in the bed they've got enough space to spread out, and they will merge together or spread out as they need to manage those nutrients. Plants are really good at doing that. So when we're about to look at plants, and we'll talk about spacing of plants, and it's pretty basic advice, but just making sure that you do allow the required amount of spacing should deal with that issue, and then the plants will put their roots wherever they need to in the bed. Yeah.
Could I have another follow-up question on that one real quick?
Of course.
Do you know, where do you learn about the roots of plants? Because each plant has different roots, and you learn a lot about the flower and the leaves, but actually key also is the roots. I'm struggling finding material on that area.
Yeah, yes, I agree. There's actually a book called Roots Demystified, which you might find interesting, Fran, if you're root curious. There's like lots of pictures in there. There's amazing diagrams. Basically, they've painstakingly uncovered root systems and then diagram them so you can see how far they spread and what shape they are for different plants.
Awesome.
So it's probably not like essential knowledge for gardeners, but it's definitely interesting. And the other thing that over time you come to learn is just the shape of root systems by pulling out plants, hopefully after they've cropped and died. So yeah, it's definitely come to know what root systems look like for different plants. But that book is good because you'll be really surprised by how deep some of them go. In fact, several feet deep for even common vegetables.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Kat, I have a question. It's Jimmy here.
Hi, Jimmy.
How are you? Look, I don't have a big backyard, very small, very tiny. I'm actually thinking of purchasing veggie pots. What are your thoughts in growing veggies in, veggie pots, and whether you know much about it? Because you did mention something about their commercial pots, but I don't know what you meant by that.
Yeah, okay. So, well, they're one off-the-shelf system that you can buy. And I do know a couple of people who have bought them and they're happy with them. They have, I guess, the advantage of being something you can buy and you don't need to build yourself. And they have some nice, I don't know if it's an add-on or it comes with it, but they've got like a net that comes down over the top that can keep out possums and some other things. And a lot of people really enjoy that feature of them. And they're, of course, a wicking pot, so they have all of those benefits. So I think if you've got the budget for them, great option. But they're going to be a lot more expensive than building something yourself. And I don't know if there's necessarily any great benefits to having a veggie pod as opposed to a DIY wicking bed system. Yeah.
And what would you suggest in regards to putting anything in there, like veggies? What sort of veggies in such a small...
You're jumping ahead a little bit, Jimmy. So we're actually going to go right into that after the break. Yeah, but if you'd like any more follow-up on that, just stick around at the end of the session and we can talk a bit more.
Good on you, Kat. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, a couple of people have asked about what works best in wicking beds, so
yeah,
I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah, I wasn't going to talk about wicking beds specifically. So if people are out there asking that right now, the things that I wouldn't put in there are things that like quite or on the drier side of soil and really good drainage. So things like your onion family, garlics, leeks, onions often don't really love very moist soil. And if you're growing herbs like thyme and rosemary and oregano, lavender, marjoram, those sorts of drier climate Mediterranean herbs, they don't need a wicking bed and they probably won't enjoy it either. So just save them for a dry pot somewhere else.
Sita had one about watering plants at night and can it encourage pests?
Can it encourage pests? It will certainly encourage any slugs and snails to come out and explore your garden. I'm not sure about any other pests it could do, but they're the main ones. And yeah, so wet nights after rain or watering, you will see an influx of slugs and snails. You can deal with them, and we're going to look at them in the pest session that we've got coming up for the councils as well.
Awesome. Danielle had one about finding the happy medium between getting the most out of your space without overcrowding plants.
Yeah, okay, great. So there's lots of questions that we are, I think, about to cover or at least touch on. So just hang on to those ones, folks. And I know that there'll probably be a few more questions after we've done that section. And so if you want to stick around and ask them after 12 today, I'd be happy to help.
We've just hit 11:40.
Okay, beautiful. I hope this doesn't feel too rushed, folks. I've been quite ambitious with what we're trying to put into the session for you today. So I'm going to keep going and just trust that if there's things that you need to follow up, you'll do that at the end with further questions. So without further ado, I'm going to jump back into my slides. Is that working okay, Beck? Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to go into plants now. And I know some of you might be surprised and maybe a bit frustrated that we're waiting this long to talk about the plants that you're so excited about growing from the beginning. But I guess everything that I've experienced as a food gardener to date has taught me that if you get design right, soil right and water right, a lot of the issues that you have with plants will sort themselves out. So we've really invested time there in this session because of the significance and the value of those other areas. But of course, when it comes down to plants, there are some things to know about what to plant, and how to get the most out of your space. So again, focusing on what I think are the most essential pieces of information for beginners at this stage of your gardening journey, I need to say, if you've only got a small space, leafy greens and herbs are what will give you the most value for that space. And I think you probably saw that quite clearly with Rabea and with Steve in the video from Gardening Australia. That's what they focused on, and they're actually producing most of their needs from a really, really tiny area. So it's not to say that you can't grow other things, but you'll start to just drop the yield that you're able to achieve from a smaller area. One of the things that I notice when people are getting started is they often reach for plants and I just want to stop them and go, oh, don't grow that, grow this instead. And one of the main offenders there is English spinach, which a lot of us are used to buying from shops as baby spinach leaves perhaps, or frozen spinach, and it's delicious and I love the stuff, but it's bloody hard to grow well. I'm just being honest with you here. I've never been able to grow a good crop of English spinach. It's really finicky, doesn't last very long. It cooks down to almost nothing. So it's a frustrating plant for people. And I always hope that that's not people's first experience of growing food, because you are setting yourself up for a challenge. And no doubt some of you have perfect crops of English spinach out there. So good on you, that's what I say. But what I would encourage for beginners is for you to try growing silver beet instead of English spinach. And you can cook that up and use it in almost all the same ways. But silver beet, if you plant it, say in spring, you're going to spend 10 minutes planting it, and you can actually pick that silver beet for an entire year. So you don't have to replant it. It's really reliable. It grows pretty well, even in shade. It is a super plant for people who are just getting started. So if you can swap it over in your cooking, I'm begging you to try silver beet and rainbow chard and Swiss chard instead of English spinach. For people getting started as well, one of the things to know is just when you're harvesting these plants, we don't harvest the whole plant at once. So I've got my pen again, and in this silver beet photo, I'm just going to show you where this plant's being cut in case it's a little bit unclear. And hopefully you can see there that it's actually being cut all around the edges. So the key here is we want to leave this center, which is going to keep growing for us. And we want to make sure that we don't disturb that because that's what's going to give us a year's worth of silver beet from one plant. So by taking only the oldest outside leaves first, we just let it keep regenerating. Now, it's quite important that we don't pick too hard too soon. So I'm going to suggest that for plants like silver beet, you want them to be at least about 30 or 40 centimetres high, and you want to always leave about 6 large leaves on the plant, because these leaves are like solar panels, and if you take away all the solar panels, you're not going to get any more plants coming out or any more leaves coming out. So it's just some simple advice. I know if there's experienced gardeners out there, that'll seem very basic, but I know that a lot of people don't instinctively know that when they start gardening. And that is the same for plants like cut lettuces, although they'll be a little bit smaller. Loose leaf lettuces where you're harvesting a leaf at a time. It's the same for plants like kale, for example. If you can think of some, you might want to pop them in the chat as well for the people who've been gardening for some time. But yeah, just know that we're just going to harvest outside leaves first. And then there's just some pictures of herbs here for you, common herbs that we use that are easy to grow in the garden. And I've deliberately put them in 2 different photos here because they like different things. So some of these basic herbs like rosemary and thyme, chives, also oregano and sage fit into this window. These are all drier herbs, and they'll cope with a lot less moisture than most common vegetables. So it's always nice to plant them together, or at least not mix them up with things that need a lot of water to get the most value out of your water. And then your wetter herbs are your parsleys and your mints, and there's a few more things in that photo. Those really like good consistent moisture, so you're going to need to make sure they stay quite moist. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move along now. So as well as your leafy greens and herbs, and the more common ones that we're familiar with, I also wanted to draw your attention to some less common vegetables that, if you can incorporate them into your diet, will make your gardening life so much easier. So these are my favourites that I wanted to share with you. And for people who've been asking me, what do I plant in a small space? These are some real winners for you. The one on the left-hand side is wild rocket. And that is actually really different to the type of rocket that you're usually sold in punnets and as seeds. And it's got a particular scientific name, which I'm going to type for you, Diplotaxis tenuifolia. Never quite sure if I'm pronouncing it right. I've popped that in the chat for you. But wild rocket is a real champion of a plant. This is the type of rocket that you'll actually be served in hospitality now because it's so much easier for market gardeners to grow. But you have to hunt around to get the seed as a home gardener. Now, this little champion is perennial, meaning that it grows for more than one season, often several years, in fact. It also self-seeds. So if you let that seed, if you let the plant flower and then set seed and drop, you will have it coming up from seed. It's a dry soil specialist, so it's really tolerant of poor dry soils. And just to prove that, this is a photograph of Rabea and Steve's courtyard. And when I visited them, they actually had some growing between brick pavers. And they said the stuff in the paving tastes better than the stuff in the wicking bed. So how's that for a champion plant? I'm going to give a little warning on top, though, that it is considered a weed in some areas. So especially if you're near sensitive remnant bushland and other ecosystems that are quite fragile, please check before you plant this. But for everyone else, this is a real winner and one that I'd strongly, strongly recommend for small spaces. The other plants that you've got on the screen there, the one at the top is amaranth. And amaranth is actually also a common weed. There's a bit of a theme here. It's an incredibly nutritious green that you can eat raw when the leaves are small and young, or you can cook them up like a spinach when they're older. The seed is also edible, though it's quite difficult to get large enough quantities to make that worthwhile in a home garden. Amaranth I mention in particular because it is rock solid through the hot weather that we get in summer in Melbourne. It's one of the few things that if I don't water it, I know it's going to be okay. So amaranth is just one of those resilient champion plants that particularly going into a future with maybe quite uncertain climates and a lot less water security, it's one that I certainly want to have in my garden. And the one at the bottom is Mizuna, which is a type of mustard. And also I've got some Osaka red mustard at the bottom there. And if you are looking for an easy salad green, lettuces are lovely, but they often need to be replanted and they're a little bit fragile in the garden. Mizuna tends to last longer, it's a little bit stronger, more vigorous, doesn't need to be replanted so often. You've probably had it in salad mix anyway, so you probably already like the flavour of it without knowing it. So I'd strongly recommend trying some Mizuna at home. Just use it like a lettuce or another salad green. And the Osaka red mustard I mention in particular because it seems to grow really, really well in shade, or at least in part shade. So if you know that you've got a very shaded balcony or courtyard, that's one I'd definitely explore. When you eat it raw, you get a hot wasabi mustard flavour, which some people love and other people don't. But when you cook it, all of that heat comes out of it and it just becomes like any other nice cooked green with a mustard flavour, but not a mustard heat. So I know they're a little bit random, but just some ideas for you there on other things that you can try to reduce the effort while still getting a great yield. Okay, moving along, some other choices that I look out for are plants that we can harvest for a long time and plants that have parts that you can harvest that are edible that aren't just the main part of the crop. So a classic example for me is the difference between growing a headed broccoli and a sprouting broccoli. I don't grow the headed broccolis much anymore because after eating the same broccoli for 2 weeks, which we had to when we grew some really big ones, you get kind of sick of it and then you have no broccoli. Whereas with the sprouting broccoli, we can harvest them really consistently for a couple of months as long as we keep picking them. And those smaller, more tender leaves are also a great cooked green, much like you'd throw in a cabbage leaf or a kale leaf into a stir fry. So be on the hunt for plants that have got what I call vegetable offal, the bits that you can eat that other people often throw away. And sometimes you'll double the yield from that particular plant and of course from your space. I also look out for really high yielding varieties, plants that do better than other plants of the same species. So over time, I've done, again, more side-by-side trials in my garden. It's not a great sample size, I know, but you certainly notice that this tomato is doing a lot better than that tomato. And so that's the one I'll take seed from and keep growing. And if you do that for a couple of years, you build up an A team of your best mate varieties. And those are the ones that you're going to rely on to feed you. And there is significant difference between one type of tomato and another, and one type of bean and another type of bean. I had no idea when I started gardening just how big that range could be. So if you're not having good success, try another variety and see if it works better. And ask other local gardeners, ask your neighbours, have a yarn over the fence. What are the tomatoes that are growing well for you in this garden at this time? Also, just coming back to using vertical space and the question that we had earlier, poles, trellises, fences, trees, those are all canvases for your food gardening efforts. And by using that vertical space, you can sometimes save a bit of space in the ground. So these are the candidates that I turn to most. The indeterminate tomatoes, the ones that just keep growing until the cold weather comes. Climbing peas and beans, cucumbers. There's a type of zucchini called tromboncinos, which grows more like a pumpkin. And you can eat them like a zucchini, or you can let them turn into a sort of a pumpkin. and of course pumpkins themselves. And that really makes the most of a small planting area. Coming to spacing, I know there have been a few questions about this. Again, my advice is pretty boring, I'm afraid, but it's one that I got wrong all the time when I started growing food. I used to buy a punnet of seeds or grow seeds myself, and then I would instinctively want to put them all into the garden because I couldn't leave any of them behind. I didn't want any of them to get composted or, you know. So what I was trying to do was cram them in and hope that I'd still get the same yield. But unfortunately, for most vegetables, you don't get more yield by packing the plants in. What you often get is dwarf stunted plants and not the yield that you were expecting. So my advice with spacing is, especially while you're getting started and learning to garden, check the labels, check the seed packets, and do try and pay attention to the spacing that they recommend. Because if you push that, sometimes, the results are just not very good. Over time, and using observation, bit of trial and error, you can start to learn to pack vegetables in, and you'll know which roots are going to compete with what other roots in the garden. But that is just something that needs to come through experience and from talking to other gardeners. But you can still get really tightly packed beds and still obey the spacings. And this is one example of my brassica bed that's also got some radicchio and some daikon radishes in there. So you can see it's very densely planted, but I am still paying attention to that spacing to make sure that they can all expand to their full capacity. The other thing about this image that you can see here is I've deliberately graded it. So we've got the taller plants at the back and shorter plants at the front. And that is extremely important in winter when the sun's at a very low angle and shade can be quite deep. So actually the planting plan you've got on the right is reversed. So that's north to the top, whereas the camera is the north in the photograph, if that makes sense. But they're virtually the same bed. So you can see I've got the cauliflowers at the back because they're really tall. Then I've got the kale because they're a tiny bit shorter and a bit more narrow. And then I progress to the daikons and then the cabbages and radicchio at the front that are quite short. So I pay a lot of attention to that. I also pay attention to how I'm going to be harvesting or using the vegetable. If I know I'm going to need to pick it every day, like wild rocket, for example, I will put it around the edges of the garden where I can easily get to that without too much fuss. If it's something like a corn cob that I really only harvest once when the corn cob's grown, that can go in the centre of the bed or right down the back. I'm not going to be needing to mess around with that very much. So I talk about the pick offens and the pick onces, and that is a great determinant of where I put things in the bed. I'll also put together plants that need similar things, whether that's netting or just a type of management. In this case, I've got a net over my brassicas to control cabbage white butterflies, and that would be a lot harder if they were spread throughout the garden. What I don't do is pay a lot of attention to companion planting charts, which I know is something a lot of you will have questions about. And I have to be honest, I find that I get great results just doing these more basic things. And I think that they have a greater determinant of success than matching up one or two plants together that are supposed to have benefits. I do a little bit of that, but it's not the thing that determines the overall planting. And to be honest, it does your head in a system like this when it's really dense. Okay, tiny bit on pests. And I know there'll be questions, but I'm keeping my eye on the clock. We're just going to do a little bit on pests before we finish up today, knowing that we have a full session on pests coming up where we can answer a lot more questions on this topic. So if you're starting out right now and you're wondering, what do I do? Firstly, just again, the patterns to detail approach. If your garden design is good, your plants are in the right spot, they're getting enough sun, soil's healthy, the moisture's good, you prevent a lot of pest and disease issues. So hopefully we can prevent a lot of those things from happening. There's always going to be pests that show up though. And the next thing is I'll only intervene if it's an actual real problem. So what I mean by that is if we've got a leaf that's got a few holes in it and I can still eat that leaf and there's still enough of the leaf and I've still got a crop, I don't necessarily think it's always a problem that I have to intervene. And we actually need pests. And that's a surprise actually to realise that. But without pests, we don't have predators. And without predators, we don't have an ecology. without a balanced ecosystem, we're working really hard. So the goal is actually a consistent low level of pests throughout the year, rather than complete elimination, which of course leads to a big surge in something else coming in and sometimes complicated issues. If I am going to look for pest management techniques, I'm going to start with something that's really simple and cheap and homemade. And often that's just me going in and squashing eggs. I don't know if you can see the egg there. It's a little yellow dot. Those of you with good eyesight will see it, maybe not if you're on an iPhone. So I do a lot of hand picking off caterpillars and squashing eggs because it's a small garden, and I can do that while I'm watering without much extra effort. I'm seeing some extra artwork on my screen. Thank you for the person who's popping that in. But I'll also look for crops that are resistant and some other tricks as well that we'll look at in the session. I'll only go for commercial organic sprays if those other methods don't work. And I fundamentally and finally work towards a balanced garden ecosystem. So I won't be able to go into why just for now, but know that plants with small flowers, like the umbrella-shaped flowers on the left, alyssum in the centre, and the daisy family as well, are really key to bringing in the predatory insects that control things like aphids and caterpillars and scale and whitefly, and quite a lot of other garden pests as well. So that's a bit of a teaser for the session that we've got later with Council. We're going to come back for a whole 2-hour session on how to get those garden ecosystems functioning well, and other tricks and techniques for managing pests and disease. I know some people will have burning questions about a particular pest, and we'll get to those in the questions that follow after the session. But I'm going to leave it there for now, and just wish you all good luck. And again, I know this has been a real overview, but I am hoping that that has hopefully shortcut some of the early trial and error that I went through, and will enable you to start confidently on those topics. And then you'll be able to pick up a lot more throughout the other sessions with Stonington, and also just through your own learning and experience as you garden. So good luck out there, folks. And I'm also on Instagram if any of you want to connect with me on there. And I'll let Beck say the final words, and then we'll do some more questions. So thanks for your time this morning.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Kat. Yes, I just want to say a huge thank you. I hope that everyone got a lot out of that session. And I think probably like you guys, or like me, you're feeling sufficiently inspired to get out into the garden and have a bit of a play today. I think I'll definitely be going out and checking my soil, and maybe adding another layer of mulch as well, because I've got some leaves scattering my courtyard. I do want to just take a moment to make a little request of all of you. Obviously there was so much in there, that 2-hour session. It is just the start of the sessions that we're going to be running over the next 4 weeks. But I do just want to make a quick request and ask that you just take a minute and make a note down of one thing that you're going to one kind of piece of knowledge or tip or trick that you might try in the next, or this weekend or the next week. And it could be, you know, going out and testing your soil, the finger test. It could be switching up the mulch that you're using. It could be changing the way you're watering, or maybe trying out some new plants or new species like wild rocket or mustard green. I'd just love for you to, you know, take at least one tip and make some sort of change to the way you're gardening, or try something new. And yeah, just a reminder that this webinar today was the first of a series of 4 webinars with Kat. So next week we've got soil health, the following we've got plant propagation, and the last one is managing garden pests. So the soil health workshop next week is actually in the afternoon, so it's a 2 p.m. start. And like this one, you'll get an email from me with the link. It will be the correct link this time. I promise I will check it 50 million times. But we hope to see you there. And if you can't attend that one but you're interested, do sign up do register for the event, and you'll get the follow-up email with a link to the recorded session. And likewise, I'll be sending out an email after this one with a link to the session, and also with the notes that I mentioned at the start of the session, which will capture a lot of what Kat talked about. Just a reminder that this series with Kat is also part of a much larger series of sustainable living events that are brought to you by Stonington Council, Yarra Council, the City of Glen Ira and the City of Port Phillip, and there's a whole range of events to help you take climate action and live sustainably from home. The next couple of events coming up, we've got some advice on buying renewable energy and saving energy at home. There's an awesome workshop from Glen Ira City Council, which is all about citizen science for kids. We have another one focused purely on habitat gardening at home, and that will be another one that will be really great for kids. We'll be doing a workshop on keeping chooks in your backyard. So yeah, lots on offer, and I do encourage you to check out the program if you haven't seen it. That will be in my follow-up email. And I just wanted to also say that this event is part of a much wider program that the City of Stonington delivers to help support our community to live more sustainably. Throughout the year, we run tree planting events, we run workshops on waste, we support our community to improve energy efficiency and install solar. We offer discounted compost products, compost bins, worm farms and bokashi bins. So if you do want to find out about all of those programs and events, I will send a link and you can subscribe to our newsletter. And just one last thing I do want to mention for Stonington residents. In February this year, the City of Stonington declared a climate emergency, and that was basically recognising that the climate emergency that we found ourselves in needs immediate and urgent response from Council, which is a really exciting declaration from Council. And we are now seeking some input from our community. So it's all about what you think a climate ready Stonington might look like. And we're really seeking ideas. So maybe if you think this is a really important component of preparing for a changing climate, supporting gardening, supporting urban food systems, then maybe you could share that information in our online forum. So I'll also send a link to that one. My email will be jam-packed with lots of information and links. But I just want to finish up now and just say a massive thanks to Kat Lavers for running this session. And I think now we will take some more questions. But yeah, hope to see lots of you next Saturday at 2 p.m. for another session on soil.
Thank you so much, Beck. I'm going to stop the recording now if that's okay with you, Beck.
Yeah, of course.
Lovely. Okay.